Hi, welcome to the long-awaited season 3 premiere of The Breakdown. I'm your host, James Sayer, and tonight we are going to be talking about the fascinating concept of panpsychism, the concept that proposes that all matter is at some level conscious, that all matter within the universe, whether it be an electron, a quark, a molecule, an atom, everything in existence that has mass at some level has some degree of consciousness. It's a pretty far out there concept. Most people are not familiar with it, but it has a long tradition, a long philosophical tradition going back over 2,500 years. The first Greek philosopher we know of, his name was Thales, around 2,500 years ago, was the first to really propose a formal concept of what we now consider panpsychism. Then the following century, about 2,400 years ago, the philosophers Anaxagoras and Empedocles also continued on the tradition of panpsychism. But not in that name itself. There were other Greek thinkers that continued that tradition as well. But it wasn't until the 1500s that the actual term panpsychism was coined by the philosopher Francesco Patrizzi in the 1500s. He's the one who actually came up with the formal name. So that the name itself, the concept itself, the formal concept has actually been around for half a millennium. 500 years, pretty amazing. But then there were other philosophers in the 1600s like Leibniz and Spinoza who also proposed forms of panpsychism, the belief that there is, that all matter at some level is conscious. In the 1800s is really the heyday of panpsychism, where you had a number of different philosophers like Arthur Schopenhauer, Wilhelm Wundt, William James, Josiah Royce, and William Clifford, to name just some of them. That was really the heyday of the 1800s. Was the greatest time for support for the concept of panpsychism. And then you had, in the 20th century, Alfred North Whitehead was a strong supporter of panpsychism, and also Bertrand Russell offered a number of ideas which were consistent with panpsychism as well. They refer to it as Russellian monism. We'll talk about that briefly. Then in the latter part of the 20th century, panpsychism fell out of favor with a lot of philosophers. And very few people really touched it in the last part of the 20th century. But in the first part of the 21st century, we've seen sort of a resurgence with renewed interest by a number of different philosophers in analytical philosophy, including Doctors Philip Goff, David Chalmers, Luke Roelofs, and Hedda Hasselmorch are all some of the leading thinkers right now that propose some form of panpsychism. And so we're going to talk about that. It sounds crazy, right? It's basically that the main concept is that everything in the universe has some type of a mind, some level of consciousness, and that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous, meaning it's everywhere, and it is an intrinsic part of all matter. That all matter at some level is conscious. Now, panpsychism is not to be confused with panprotopsychism, which is a similar but competing philosophy that states that it's not consciousness that is ubiquitous and fundamental, but proto-consciousness is ubiquitous and fundamental, meaning that all matter isn't necessarily conscious at some level, but has certain attributes. All matter has certain attributes that are proto-conscious, that if combined under certain circumstances with, other particles or whatever, that could lead to consciousness, possibly. So that's pan proto consciousness. So It's not quite the same as saying everything's conscious, but it's saying everything could become conscious under certain conditions, basically. But we're just focusing on panpsychism tonight, the concept, the general concept. And there are many different schools of thought. That's the crazy thing, is there's different forms of panpsychism. So there's two basic forms of panpsychism, right? One is pan-experientialism, meaning that all matter has some form, some level of experience. So not necessarily thought. So like an electron, a quark isn't necessarily, isn't thinking, right? Isn't thinking about what they're going to do today or anything like that. There's no thought occurring, but it has an experience. An electron, a quark, a molecule has some type of experience of what it's like to be an electron. It exists. It exists in the physical world and is affected by the other particles and other things around it, and reacts to those other particles around it, and has behavior that is observable. So that's not to say that it has a mind in the sense that it has a brain. We know that they don't have brains, right? There's no observable, but that's the entire point. And the controversy of panpsychism is that there is consciousness without a brain, right? It's widely accepted that we're conscious. Now, there are actually some philosophers who argue the case that consciousness is an illusion. We're not going to discuss that tonight. We're going to stick with the widely held assumption that we are conscious, which seems, to most of us to be extremely self-evident, that we are alive and we are experiencing our existence, right, individually, and that I have an individual consciousness and you have one, and we can have a collective consciousness as a group together, but that each one of us has, as a result of our brain, ostensibly, according to science, thus far, that it's, consciousness evolves from the brain. And there's different, theories about how consciousness evolves from the brain. And we'll talk about one of those leading theories, which we've already discussed in a previous episode, called integrated information theory, which actually lines up in many respects with panpsychism, interestingly enough. So we'll talk about that as well. So there's also, so I was saying there's two forms of panpsychism. One is the pan-experientialism, meaning that all matter is conscious on some level, but, let's say that like an electron has like a core, or a quark has like the lowest level of consciousness, extremely unimaginably basic form of consciousness. Pancognitivism, the second form of panpsychism, is that everything has thought. It's a more advanced concept of consciousness. It's not just experience. It's not just sensing something. It's not just experiencing something occurring to you and having that experience, but that it's thinking about it as well, that there's thought that occurs. Now, that's easy for us to accept again with animals in the animal kingdom. But if you don't have a brain, how can there be thought? Right? That's a hard thing to get around, right? If there's no brain, how can you be thinking? How can you be conscious? Right? That's very difficult. That's a difficult concept to wrap your mind around. So, but there's different, and of course, most in analytic philosophy, there's most support for the concept of pan-experientialism, meaning that most matter in the universe is not thinking, right? It's not thinking about anything, but it's experiencing something, meaning it's sensing something. There is something that it's like to be a particle, to be a piece of matter, no matter how small or insignificant that you are. But that there's so many different schools of panpsychism. One of them is micropsychism, which basically states that all consciousness is grounded at the micro level, right? That it is fundamental that there is consciousness at the micro level, not necessarily thought, but that even at the smallest level, all consciousness is dependent on the micro consciousness that exists throughout even the smallest pieces of matter. But that, like electrons, again, I say, they have experience, but not thought. A very basic form of experience. But then there's also cosmopsychism, which is the concept that the universe is conscious, right? That not only that there's levels of consciousness throughout all matter, but that the universe in itself is conscious as well, encompasses all the consciousness within the universe, but has its own separate consciousness as a result of all the combined consciousnesses. It has its own. So we'll talk about that as well. There are other schools of thought I'm not going to get into because you really get into the weeds. There's a lot of really smart people who spend a lot of time thinking about this, and they go in a lot of different directions in a lot of ways about the different points of view and different outlooks. So there's different schools within different schools of panpsychism, and there's even disagreement on what we mean by consciousness, right? Most people, when we think of consciousness, we think of thinking, my conscious mind, what I'm thinking about right now in the moment. But when analytical philosophers talk about consciousness, they're really referring to it not necessarily as thought, right? It certainly is thought, incorporates thought, but is also the experience of what it is to be you, right? Just like there's the experience of what it is to be you, there's the experience of what it is to be a squirrel, there's the experience of what it is to be a human organ, there's the experience of what it is to be a human cell, there's the experience of what it is to be a mitochondria. We don't know what that is, but we know there is one. Now, how do they feel about it? They don't think about it. How can they feel about it? Right? But we do know, and this is interesting, we'll talk about this here, is that, and this is from an article from last year in the journal Neuroscience and Behavioral Reviews by Dr. Martin Picard and Dr. Carmen Sandy, two scientists who study neuroscience. And basically, this is what they found. Sociality has profound evolutionary roots and is observed from unicellular organisms to multicellular animals. And a growing body of data highlight the social nature of mitochondria. They are social organelles that communicate with each other and the cell nucleus. They exhibit group formation, interdependence, synchronized behaviors. They specialize to accomplish specific functions. Now that's mitochondria. And we also know from science that even genes within genomes cooperate to form our DNA. So there is cooperation throughout the animal kingdom. We know this in plants and in trees in particular, that there are a number of types of trees that will pass on their nutrients from their roots to trees that that are dying, that will not survive past, a few years, but they will essentially commit a form of altruism, right? Without a brain, but they do it anyway, right? For whatever reason that is determined by their genes, right? That there is even without a brain, there's cooperation. Now, I won't go as far as to say there's altruism throughout all matter, right? Or altruism, we're defining altruism as we're doing something that is, going to help someone else and leave me worse off, essentially. And we do see that with plants, and we do see that with trees, making that sort of sacrifice where they really have nothing to gain from helping something that is going to die, but they do it anyway. And we don't know why that is. They don't have a brain to think about that, make a decision to do it in the way that we would, but they cooperate, they communicate, they execute strategies together. When we're talking about, plants that have, defensive techniques or predatorial techniques like the Venus flytrap, there's all types of things that we're just beginning to learn about the universe. And we see more and more, the more we learn, that there's cooperation at basically every level of the animal kingdom. So this adds, and these two doctors, they're not proponents of panpsychism, but it is interesting that this finding about mitochondria, and sort of the, social behavior that goes on within cells, right? That, there's cooperation, even though there's, it's below the cellular level. It's mitochondria is just an organelle. It's just a structure within a cell, right? But the interesting thing is that mitochondria actually was a cell at one point that gave up its single cell status to join with other cells to form a eukaryotic cell, a cell with a nucleus. So they sacrifice their independence to join together. We won't say that's altruism, but it's certainly cooperation. And they join together to form a cell with a nucleus, and work and cooperate together and carry out different functions to make that cell work. We don't know where this comes from, but the basic concept is, right, that within panpsychism is that that consciousness cannot come from things which are not conscious. That consciousness exists at our level because consciousness exists everywhere. That the panpsychists' claim is that you cannot take a bunch of stuff that is unconscious and combine it in any way at all. No matter what you do, no matter how brilliant an engineer you might be, there's nothing you could do to combine a bunch of unconscious particles, elements, things to form a conscious being. The only way you can do that is to take things that are conscious already on some level, combine those conscious entities to form a higher consciousness. And you can kind of see that, really, when you think about, all right, let's just assume that all things have some level of consciousness, some level of, well, we're saying consciousness, we're not saying thought, we're saying some type of experience, right? From the quark level, the electron level, right? The subatomic particle level, all the way up to the atomic, the molecular, all the way up to within the animal kingdom, the unicellular to the multicellular organisms and even within us, right? Trillions upon trillions of cells. And when you think about the DNA within every cell, right? All the cooperation going on, right? That the experiences of all these different particles cooperating together to influence each other, right? And that higher consciousnesses of each inform the next. And so that's kind of the problem with panpsychism is the question, what they call the subject summing problem. It's how do you add all these little consciousnesses up to get ours, right? Or how do you take all these trillions upon trillions of minute consciousnesses to create a greater one? How does that work? Well, we have no idea. But there is the concept in neuroscience called integrated information theory, and it's one of the two most popular theories in neuroscience currently. It was developed by Dr. Giulio Tononi in 2004, and basically, integrated information theory is a theory that the degree of consciousness is measurable, and it's that information has to be organized and integrated and shared across regions or subsystems within your brain to occur, right? That it's the sharing of information. But that consciousness is, according to integrated information theory, consciousness is nothing more than integrated information. That's it. and that, that it's just, and that any system, right, any system in existence, basically, according to integrated information theory, has some level of consciousness. Any system, not necessarily even human, right? It doesn't have to be human. Doesn't even necessarily have to be a brain, though that's typically how neuroscientists think in those terms. But any system that shares information would, according to integrated information theory, have a certain level of consciousness that you could measure. Now, they haven't figured out how to do that, but there are some similarities here about integrated information theory that do kind of neatly line up with panpsychism. And it was Christoph Koch who's actually said that has described, Dr. Christoph Koch described described integrated information theory as a refined version of panpsychism. Now, Tononi doesn't go nearly as far in saying that. He says basically that integrated information theory incorporates certain aspects of panpsychism, but not others. So there are some interesting similarities that help add further credence to the concept of panpsychism. It's not a theory because there's no way to test it. There's no way to know if a proton is conscious, right? There's no way to test if a rock is conscious, right? And how does the consciousness of all these subatomic particles, how does that form a higher consciousness at the atomic level or the molecular level? And what's the how is a rock conscious, right? And there's different, right? What is it like to be a rock, right? It's, some philosophers think it's just like a blur, right? You're a collection basically of particles. There's no thinking going on, but you're a collection of particles that are moving, that are interacting. I know we can't see that, but you are interacting with other particles right next to you. And that world, that existence, the life, I'm not saying they're alive, they're not, but the existence of subatomic particles or atomic particles, that it's very limited to the particles around it. That's the world that they know. They don't know they're inside a rock. They don't know they're part of comprising a rock. They have no awareness of that, but they are aware of the particles around them. That is their world, and that is what they're conscious of, consciously experiencing. Not in thought, but they are experiencing it, right? There is an experience. And here's the other thing. Just like you and I, that as many similarities as we all have towards one another genetically, that we're all infinitely different in that all the particles and subatomic particles that make us up are constantly being influenced by immeasurable forces and influences around us at every single moment of our lives. Most of them even unseen, that we're constantly being influenced by. Everything about us is in a constant state of change, of flux. We have this idea that we're like in some static state, but we're not. On the cellular level, on the atomic level, on the subatomic level, we're at a constant state of change. And we're organized as this group of particles, cells, right? An organized system of cells working together, right, to keep us alive, to function as this multicellular organism, which is basically what we are, a very advanced multicellular organism, right? All these particles right now are cooperating to keep me going, to help me survive and continue and reproduce, right? And so that the next generation, can move forward and continue the line. That cooperation, that exists, arguably even perhaps below, what they've already established at the animal kingdom. Is there cooperation? That's the question. All right. Some type of cooperation from this consciousness at the subatomic level, that transfers on up the line to the molecular and the unicellular. Uh, there's more questions than there are answers, of course, but that leads us to, ask, is this that crazy? Is it crazier than what most of us believe? Because most of us believe that you have a soul, right? Myself included. That's what I believe. I was raised to believe that, and it's it's just I think the vast majority of people, especially Americans, believe in a soul, a consciousness that exists separate from the body, that survives after death. There's no evidence. There's zero scientific evidence to support that. There's been nothing. There's lots of anecdotal stories that have been put out in recent years. A lot of them are pretty fascinating. Like out of body experiences, near death experiences. But there's always at least one more plausible scientific explanation for why someone has had an out of body or near death experience. That's more plausible than there being some type of soul or separate consciousness existing from the body. There's no physical evidence to suggest that that's actually the case. Now, it may be true. We may have souls, right? We just don't have any evidence at all. None, right? Scientific evidence so far is just pointing towards, we're a collection of, DNA, functioning, cooperatively to survive. And so that's, there's two competing philosophies, right, about consciousness in general. One is dualism, which is what I just described, the basic concept that you have a brain, but your brain is not really the seat of consciousness. The seat of consciousness is the soul, and the soul has some interaction with the brain, right? But it's really the soul is who you are, the non-physical, right, immaterial, unprovable soul, right, that most of us believe in, that we think it somehow interacts with the brain. There's no evidence to show, nothing's been proven in any experiment that there's anything interacting with our brain externally. So it's an interesting concept that's been around for millennia, that most of us still believe, but most scientists don't believe it. Most philosophers do not believe it. They believe in the concept of monism, meaning that all consciousness comes from the physical, basically. That there's no soul, there's no separate consciousness from the body. That your consciousness is derived from your body and nothing else. There's no soul. And Panpsychism doesn't allow for there to be a soul or a God. It's not necessarily inconsistent with the concept of a God or a creator, but is not to be confused with the concept of pantheism, which is the idea that God is everywhere, God is everything, that God is the universe. So that's the difference. Whereas cosmopsychism is that the universe is conscious. It believes, according to the cosmopanpsychism, that the universe is actually conscious. There's a universe consciousness that does exist, that has arisen from the combined consciousnesses of the universe, and that this universal consciousness, is derived from all the subordinate consciousnesses. It's really out there, right? So panpsychism isn't saying God created us, that there's a creator, but that there is universal consciousness at some level. And that the more advanced you get, right, as far as matter is concerned, the more advanced system of matter, where you have some types of matter, cooperating with other types of matter to be a larger piece of matter, whether it be an animal or a rock or a plant or whatever, but that, that there is that combined experience that the more advanced you become, the more aware you become. And in some degree, you can kind of see this, our awareness changes individually, right? As you learn more, as you develop more in life, you become more aware of things than you were before. Your consciousness expands. And so too, as you add skills, as you add knowledge, you add consciousness. And so it's like, as you add complexity to your thought, you develop greater consciousness. And so in the same vein, that when you add greater, you add these consciousness together, the greater complexity there is, the more information sharing and complexity, the greater the consciousness in total. So there's no way to prove this. It's just a concept. There's no way for us to test it, but it is a fascinating idea. Like I said, there are some people who think that there is that consciousness is an illusion. We'll probably talk about that on another episode. But I think most of us would agree we are conscious. But it is something interesting to think about, that consciousness may actually come from all things, right? And that while your table doesn't know what it's like to be a table, it has the experience of being a table. Right? It's not thinking about being a table, but it's a table. And it's in the physical world experiencing what it is to be your table. And that doesn't necessarily feel anything about that, but it's experiencing being there in your room on the floor. It is. Now, we don't know what that's like, but that's kind of the mission of panpsychism, is to understand, what is it like? What is it like to be, a proton, to be a quark? What is it like to be an atom? What is that experience? And how do we determine that? If we could determine it, that could explain all kinds of fascinating aspects of the universe, because science can explain a lot about how the brain works, but it really can't tell us anything right now about, what it's like, to be you, to experience, you and your feelings, and what makes things feel the way they feel to you, beyond, hormones, right? And why do the hormones make you feel that specific way, right? What is it about those hormones, right, that give you that specific feeling? Why is it that color of the red looks that way? Why does that smell that way? What is the intrinsic nature of things, of matter, that combines to create consciousness? So something to think about. I know it's definitely out there, but it's an interesting concept. I would like to talk more about it, but we can't go on forever. But it is really fascinating. I hope that you've enjoyed our discussion about it. We might discuss more about it at another time, but for now, I think that's enough. I hope you've enjoyed it. And our next episode, we're going to be talking about Julian Assange. He's facing extradition very soon, or possibly from the UK to the United States for charges of committing espionage against the United States. So we're going to look into that. Should he be extradited? Should he be charged with what many have called, many journalists and many papers say he's just being unfairly charged for publishing information that was leaked to him by Chelsea Manning, that he's basically being charged for doing the same thing that a journalist would do. However, the United States government makes the claim that he exceeded working as a journalist and crossed the line into working as the agent of a foreign power to actually commit espionage, not just function as a journalist, but to commit espionage against the United States. So we're going to look at all that and see, Is there validity to that claim by the government? Did he exceed his authority as a journalist, as a publisher? Did he cross the line into espionage? Is that true, or is it trumped up? We're going to find out on the next episode of The Breakdown. Until then, take care of yourselves, and I'll talk to you soon.